Hey there, nice to see you. It's the Bronx Buzz, BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters and writers and editors and journalists, people who are putting stuff out in the Bronx so we can get a real good idea of what's going on because we get the inside word. Second segment, we're going to really be excited about the opening of the Bronx Music Hall, and we'll talk about that. But right now, let's say good evening to Colin Kinniburgh, who is a reporter at New York Focus covering the state's climate and environmental politics. Nice to see you, Colin. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Gary. Glad to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Just a little bit of background since we haven't had you before. So, how did you get into reporting the climate and environmental politics?
That's a great question.
I put you right on the spot there.
I've been following climate and environmental issues since, honestly, I think I was a teenager growing up here in New York City. I grew up in the age of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, and I think that moment of when kind of climate awareness really hit us hard. So it's something I've been paying attention to for a long time. But then formally, I've lived in New York almost all my life. I moved away for a little while, and then I came back and found myself really fascinated by what was going on in New York City politics and state politics as well, and began reporting for New York Focus a few years ago. And since then, I've been covering all the ins and outs of climate and energy and environmental politics and policy at the state level for since.
Well, we could, you and I, and of course people of the Bronx could have a great dialogue with you because we've been inundated and we've been on the short end of so many things. I'm going to give you an example. We had the New York Power Authority on, and this goes back a little while, and I asked them, when are they going to get rid of the peaker plants, decommission the peaker plants, which are destroying the air in the South Bronx? And their response was, oh, our plan is for like 2035. And I said, well, that's really cold comfort for the people of the Bronx whose, kids are coughing away and everything else. But the other thing that was fascinating of what you mentioned, because it came up in my mind, when I see the levels of devastation, especially this week that we've had with Hurricane Helene all over the country, all I could think of is that 20 years ago on Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore literally predicted this was going to happen. And I think that's, for me, and probably for a lot of people, a bit of frustration because you knew it was going to happen. You didn't do anything about it, etc. Okay. So let's just talk about, now you did a story called New Yorkers Are Driving More, even as climate plan hinges on driving less. From New York City to Buffalo, people are driving a lot more than they did before the pandemic. I am a driver in New York City, in the borough of the Bronx, and there is no question that people are driving more. The roads are much more crowded than they've ever been. And so what's the story? I mean, why is that happening? What the heck do we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start by just giving a little bit of context, or maybe some numbers to put into perspective that experience you described of feeling more cars on the road, more traffic. So the data that I reported here was coming from this firm called Streetlight, which looks at traffic data nationally. And part of what was interesting here is that they were going back, 5 years, so just before the pandemic. And sure enough, they found that across the country and here in New York City and all over the state, traffic is up quite a lot since before the pandemic. So I think part of that is, a basic thing that a lot of us, experienced or maybe participated in, which was, a lot more people got cars during the pandemic because they felt that public transit was unsafe, and so a lot of people switched to cars, and they've held on to them even as the pandemic has sort of subsided. So that's one factor. E-commerce has obviously exploded as well. Everyone's gotten that much more used to ordering from Amazon and whatnot than they used to. So that's more trucks, both big trucks and smaller trucks on the streets. And
that's a really good point I hadn't thought about. Very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a big factor. And then another thing that people point to a lot is, ride sharing apps like Uber and Lyft. Those have really stuck around as well. And those are cars that are constantly on the road, right? It's not like if you have a personal car, it's parked 90% of the time and you drive it. An Uber or a Lyft is just constantly cycling. So that adds to the congestion. And so all that means more vehicle miles traveled, as in, which is a measure of total driving, right? In New York City and the whole metro area and across the state, actually all 6 metro areas that this report looked at in the state had
Let's
driving
just
up.
list them: New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, Syracuse, and Poughkeepsie.
Right. Right. And that was consistent with most cities around the country, but there were some that were pretty stark exceptions. So in California, pretty much everywhere saw reductions in driving actually over the last 5 years.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Can we explain why that would be? Not that I give a hoot about California.
Well, I care insofar as it helps us learn how maybe
Well,
New
sure.
York could do things differently, right?
But so do we know how California?
Honestly, I wasn't able to get into all the details of
Okay,
it.
that's fine.
But one thing, I mean, if you look at Los Angeles, which obviously a famously congested city, but they saw a decrease in driving over the last 5 years. They have put a lot of money into public transportation over the last, I don't know, 10, I think even 20 years, light rail, buses, all of that. And I think that is starting to pay dividends. Of course, there are many other factors that go into it, so I don't want to speculate. But
yeah, what's interesting about what you said about people buying cars, during the pandemic, we had done all kinds of different discussions with businesses, and so many businesses were hurting, and we know that the New York City office towers were empty, and now they're talking about converting many of them into housing and all that kind of stuff. I called a friend who is a car dealer, and a pretty good sized one. And I was like, "Hey man, how because everybody I talked to was like, oh, we're dying over here." And I talked to him and I said, "Hey, how you doing?" He said, "I never sold more cars in my life." He said, and I was like, "Wow, it's like a revelation." So that was the first thing that I wanted to mention. The other thing was something that you reported, and I thought this was interesting as well. Despite the trends of the last 5 years, New York remains one of the least car-dependent states in the country. Now, I understand that for New York City, which of course has a very intricate transit system, you could do percentage-wise, per capita. Yes, maybe a lot of people don't have cars, but I still think that's fascinating because, of course, we have all those cities upstate where people are driving. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think New York City is the biggest factor here. It does represent about 40% of the state's population, and even though more people are driving, most people in New York City still don't drive on a day-to-day basis. So that really pulls down our total as a state. I can't really speak too much to the public transportation systems in other cities. Buffalo, which is kind of highlighted, I mean, appears in this report, had a very sharp increase in driving. I've taken the buses there. They're not great. Albany's same, but I guess we still do have, we do have some public transportation in all of the major cities. But I really think what's bringing down our kind of per capita or per person driving is mostly New York City. And despite all of its problems, the MTA still moves more people in a day than any other public transportation in
well,
in
and
the country.
not only public transportation, then probably all the cars that are being driven in Poughkeepsie.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, let's be clear about that.
Right.
And then, of course, with the, at least for the moment, death of congestion pricing, I'm trying to think of how do we change this, but $15 billion that were taken out of the possibility for mass transit in New York City is probably not going to help. So that really is, to me, the bottom line question for you. So where do we go from here? If we know that cars are, it's not numero uno in what's causing air pollution, but how do we tell people get out of your car, get in the train, get on the street, take a bicycle or whatever? I'm not sure how to do that.
Right. I think it's very challenging, and I think when I've talked to people about this for this story that you've brought up, and for previous ones, the main thing is that you need to have the infrastructure there, the alternatives, right, to make it easy for people to take public transportation, to get on a bike, to do all those things. A lot of people, understandably, don't feel super safe getting on a bike right now with the amount of cars in the city, and cars getting bigger and bigger and whatnot. So I think so much of this is about infrastructure, and it's true that if you take away what was really the state's biggest plan at this moment, in the form of congestion pricing, to shore up our public transit infrastructure and actually fund it, it's going to be that much harder. So yeah, I mean, that's really a big question mark, and it's something we've been covering a lot.
This whole thing leads to a really much larger discussion about, in a way, the fight for the road space, because now the city has done a job, I don't want to say good or bad, of creating bus lanes, but that of course shrinks the roadway space available for cars. Then of course you add the whole. Now I thought this is I'm trying to balance this. So the mayor, over time, has decided, I think correctly, theoretically, that we need more people on bicycles. And so what they've done is created bike lanes in many places. I'll give an example. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Marshall Loop Parkway over here in the Bronx. They've created bike lanes. I drive there a lot. I don't see a lot of people on the bike on bikes. Like it doesn't seem to justify the amount of traffic that all of a sudden is backed up on Marshall Parkway, because during rush hours you got a lot of cars. So and then of course people who drive are very angry at city bike racks, that people are not using those racks, and yet they've lost 3 or 4 parking spaces every place it is. So it's this fight. And while we want to be like Amsterdam and get everybody on bicycles, I don't know how we're going to get there, because you really need to change behaviors with Americans, and they believe in freedom, and I don't know how easy it is to do that. Anyway, got about a minute, so I'll let you summarize here where we're at and where we might go to address these issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough issue for sure. It's there's a cultural element, as you said, and there are always going to be trade-offs. I think, the way, from people I've spoken to who are pushing on this, I think there's a little bit of a carrot and stick element, which something like congestion pricing had built in, where there's you have to pay more if you want to drive, and therefore it makes it a little bit more attractive to switch to a subway or something, or a bike. Yeah, one thing I'll say I haven't mentioned, I mean, the state's climate plan really does hinge not just on getting people into electric cars, but also just getting people out of their cars in general. And there's a long way still to go on that. So I'll be watching that
Yeah,
closely.
you certainly will. Changing behaviors is really a difficult thing to do for people who, and of course in the outer boroughs up here, people need cars. Because east west in the Bronx, there's no mass transit. Anyway, listen, Colin Kinniburgh, thank you so much for Kinniburgh. I want to make sure to pronounce it right. Thank you so much for being a great reporter on New York Focus. I recommend to all people watching us, check out Colin and all his colleagues on New York Focus, and we'll certainly get back to you, because we're not out of this yet.
No, we're not.
Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Great. So we're going to take a short break, folks. And then when we come back, we're going to the opening of the Bronx Music Hall. Very, very exciting.